Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and it is wonderful to see all of your beautiful smiling faces here again. So today we're just going to go over 5 quick Lightroom tips that I think are a little bit outside of the box when it comes to, well, Lightroom tips. I wanted to do this because sometimes I'm feeling pretty stagnant in my editing. Sometimes I'm approaching images and I'm just editing them the same way, or I'll come across an image and I'm like, well, I have all these tools, but I don't exactly know what I want to do. And the whole idea behind this is to try to get your creative juices flowing when it comes to editing. Maybe you won't use these tips in the exact ways that I'm explaining them, but maybe they'll get you to think outside of the box with the tools that you already have, and you go, wow, I didn't even think I could do that with that tool. So with that said, one thing to keep in mind is some of the stuff in here is a little bit more advanced than the other stuff. That stuff, I will try to link to videos that I've done in the past to kind of give a more in-depth explanation for those things, but for the most part, you can probably follow along. So with that said, let's get started. All right, so the first tip is actually really simple, and you're probably going to be like, wow, I wish I had thought about that. And it's just going to be using the crop tool to manipulate the histogram to our advantage. And if you're not familiar with what a histogram is and you're just starting out with photography, all you really need to know is that a histogram represents our image in a mathematical representation. So what that means is that our eyes tend to adjust to light. So if I'm in a darker room, brighter things are going to look brighter. If in a bright room, darker things are going to look darker. But what a histogram will do is always represent the image in a constant state. So that means that even if our eyes are adjusted to being outside, a histogram will tell us, oh, this image is too dark or too bright. And it just gives us a really quick representation so that we can kind of guide ourselves because our eyes tend to deceive us. So with that in mind, the point of this particular tip is to use the histogram to look at a particular subject in our photos. Many times we take pictures of things with really high contrast. Or maybe we have one particular subject in our photo and that's the most important part. We don't really care about the histogram for the rest of the image. So let's jump into Lightroom and it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, so here I have an image that I actually live edited on stream last week, which by the way, if you're interested in watching live streams of me editing, maybe editing your photos, viewer photos, I'm going to be having a live stream pretty much every Wednesday, I believe, and we're just hanging out. I'm just editing some photos, chatting. You can ask any questions you want. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out on my channel. So back to this image. Now, this particular image has a main subject. And to me, that main subject is this little lighthouse here. But my histogram only shows the whole image. So the whole point of this tip is to simply, let me unlock this, go in and change my crop to just basically the lighthouse. And the reason I'm doing this, and as you can tell, every time I change the crop, the histogram changes. So I can technically undo this, and let's maybe recenter it just a little bit. And now the histogram is representing basically just our subject here. And let me show you a much better example, in my opinion, for this particular trick. So this image is basically almost all dark because it was taken at night. You can see the stars, and that means our histogram is basically just showing us what we already know, that the image is completely black. But really all we care about in terms of the light values in this image are where the lightning strike is. We know that all this part is going to be dark. That's just part of the image, and that's how it is. So if I go in here and crop in using the crop tool, now I'm not leaving the image permanently like this, of course. I'm just cropping in to manipulate the histogram to give us a better idea. And there we go. Look at that. Now that we've cropped in and we're only seeing this part of the image, we get a much better idea of what our histogram represents for that part of the image, which is the part that we care the most about. So if I undo all of those crops and go back to this, that's what it looked like before. And our histogram really isn't helping us in this image. And that's kind of the tip, is that we crop into our subject. And this could be a face, it could be a subject in the photo like the lightning or the little lighthouse. And it'll give us a much better idea of the most important part of our image and how that is balanced when you're using the histogram. That's that tip. So let's move on to the next one. The next tip I have is going to be a little bit more advanced. And what I mean by that is we're going to be using a graduated filter, but not with how it's meant to be used, pretty much. We're going to be using range masks in the graduated filter. And if you are unfamiliar with those, I have a video right here that goes in full depth about range masks, super powerful, probably one of the best tools in Lightroom. But The way we're going to be using it now is we're actually going to be using the range mask for the whole image. So let me show you what I mean instead of trying to explain the whole thing. Normally you'd come over here and you'd add a graduated filter to this part of the image so that you can manipulate the sky, right? Well, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to add a graduated filter so that the whole image is being manipulated by that graduated filter. Like I said, we're not actually going to use the graduated filter for what it was intended. But now that we have that selection, we're going to go down here. We're going to turn on range masks, and then I'm going to hold Option on my Mac, which is Alt on a PC, and I'm just going to drag this slider, and then everything in white is what we're selecting, and everything in black is what we're not selecting. And my goal here is to just get basically the whole part of that sky white. And that's looking pretty good. Now again, this is representing what we're selecting. And so now that I have my mask, and I can come over here and select Show Mask, anything in red is going to show what we're selecting, and it's going to be very faint on the tops of those houses, but I promise you it's there. And now I can come in and decrease my exposure for just that area. But the other things I can do is now I can maybe warm up that part of the image because that's where the bright parts of the image are. And you might be asking yourself, well, why didn't I just go in and decrease the highlights rather than coming in here and using a graduated filter? The reason is because we have this range mask selection, we have a way more precise control over exactly what we want to target in our image. And by doing that, it means that when I adjust the highlight slider, it might hit highlights or whites that I don't want it to hit. But using the range mask, I can narrow it down to exactly the colors or the brightness, luminance values that I want to target. And what is this doing exactly? It's basically doing what you do in Photoshop, which is called luminosity masking. Now, it's not as tech advanced. You're not using a bunch of brushes or a bunch of add-ons to do the luminosity masking, but it's kind of doing the same thing. So if you're familiar with that, that's basically what this is doing. And again, it's not necessarily doing something that Lightroom can't do when you decrease a highlight slider or a white slider or bring up the shadows. But what it will do is increase the control that you have over those things. It just gives you more precision, and you can manipulate particular warmth or colors in a selection rather than just a luminance value in that selection like we just did with this photo. So that's tip number 2. So the third tip is going to kind of build on that, except we're going to be using radial filters, and we're going to be adding color or almost like light into our image. So I did a whole video on adding light into your image or creating a, how can I say, source of light in your image that you can check out here, and it'll explain everything you need to know about using radial filters to add light. So in this particular image, I've already done exactly that. So if I go in here and delete this radial filter, you can tell that the image is quite dark. I've done this on purpose. So the other thing I'm going to do before I add this back in, let me undo that actually, I'm going to cool down the whole image. And that is just to make the image a lot more blue. It makes that light a little bit more just white rather than orange. And now the whole purpose of this tip, tip number 3, is I'm going to take this radial filter that is, again, let me show you, creating the light in the image, and I'm just going to manipulate the color temp on here to add color to our light. So now those two things that I just did made that light look a lot more warm. And that's as simple as that. We just used a radial filter to manipulate the light in the photo. And now we have these really cool tones in the clouds up here. We have these really warm and almost red tones coming from the light source that we just made. So that's tip number 3, pretty simple. So the next tip is going to be dealing with black and whites. And this might be obvious to you that if you've converted some black and whites recently and you already know this trick, but for me, it wasn't obvious when I was making black and whites of some of the photos I have over the past couple of years. Now, I don't use black and white very often, but when I do, knowing this trick is vital. So right now the image is kind of set up to be where it's supposed to be when it's in color. So the color balance is about 5500 because it was sunset. Maybe it could be a little warmer, but I'm going to convert to black and white. And this image looks okay, but let me show you what happens if I just manipulate the color temperature. So if I make this more blue, more cool, look what's happening to the sky. And now we have this super contrasty black and white that looks way better than it did just a second ago. And we're doing that by manipulating the white balance of the image, which is crazy because if I hit color, it looks really terrible. But if I go into black and white it looks really good. It's got that high contrast look that a lot of people look for in their black and white images. Now, you might be asking, why does this happen? And it's because we're just bringing the blues down or increasing the blues in the image, and that typically sunlight is more warm. So it just creates that separation of blue to warm. And it just means that in the image that turns into black and white, we can make the blues dark and we can make those warm colors the bright colors. That's really all it's doing. And the last tip is, and if you happen to watch my material, my content, you're already gonna know this one. It's just the blue saturation slider and calibration. The reason I wanted to include this is because if you haven't happened to watch that video, then you're not gonna have any idea about this. And I think it's one of the easiest, quickest things you can do that most people don't know about. And if you want a more in-depth explanation, you can check out the video here. You can check out the video here on the blue saturation slider. But literally all I'm gonna do really quick, scroll down here to my calibration panel and increase my saturation by 100. And it does this magical effect on the image. And it's as simple as that. Now, if you're using classic Lightroom, which is the desktop version, it'll be there. But if you're using the mobile or app version, you won't find this tool in there. But it's as simple as that, super easy. Just increase your blue saturation to 100, add magic to your image. I don't think there's an easier tip than that. So there you go. All right, so I hope at least one of those tips helped you and it got your juices flowing when it comes to the creative side of editing. I know that sometimes I get a little stagnant with my editing or I get stumped by a photo. And I hope that those tips, even if you don't plan on using them, maybe they're too advanced, at least got you thinking outside of the box for figuring out a particular edit you might be stuck on, figuring out how you want to edit a photo that you haven't touched yet, anything like that. Speaking of editing, like I mentioned before, I'm starting to live stream edits, doing it pretty much every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, but I have been going live sporadically here and there. Last week, I had people submit photos to me for critique and editing live on air, and that was a lot of fun. So it's something I want to do more of. So if you're into any of that, make sure you're subscribed and you can turn on notifications specifically so you know when I'm going live. But either way, if you like this video, please hit the like button. It helps me out the most, and I appreciate all of your support, 100%. Thank you so much. And thank you for tuning in. Hope this was helpful, and I will see you again on the next one. Later.